There's one word to describe Mark Carney's fiscal plan for the next 4 years, that would be disaster. Disaster why? Disaster because many were hoping greater things would come from the Carney Liberals. They thought that maybe the era of Justin Trudeau's reckless spending, reckless fiscal policy, and absolute disastrous governance would be concluded. That's what many liberals, at least, were hoping. If they were naive enough to believe that, it looks like their naivety was punished, because if we look at the new fiscal and costed plan for the Liberal Party, the deficits being projected are greater than what were being projected under Justin Trudeau's Liberals. For the next year of the deficit for the fiscal year of 2025, in the Liberals, in the fall economic statement that just Chrystia Freeland rejected and refused to announce, they were hoping for a $42.8 billion upcoming deficit in the next year. But now, under Carney's plan, guess what that deficit is now? $63 billion. And how I'm getting these numbers, and how the media has also got these numbers, is by looking at these 2 points right here: the platform operating balance and the platform capital spending. Carney has made an effort to try to lighten the image on his budget by putting in some new financial tricks, and that is to separate the budget, the operating budget, into 2 components, which is, of course, the operating budget and the capital spending budget. This is not usual from a government or government policy makers to do, because, of course, when push comes to shove, the all-encompassing budget of a country cannot be summed up into these 2 categories, because usually their spending plans go in totally different directions than what they actually say they are. And this is usually what you would see from a corporation who's looking to expand their businesses, um, or their business investments or infrastructure in their business. Capital X, you call it, capital spending. Of course, Carney, coming from a business background, is interesting to see that he would implement such a thing, though it's very uncommon. But I think why he tried to do this is he tried to identify the difference in his platform is that he plans on spending more on capital spending, which is investments in the economy that will last for years to come, in his opinion. And in that regard, he says that the operating budget, so-called operating budget, who knows what it actually is, in this constituting in a government sphere, what an operating budget is and a capital budget is. Uh, the role, the idea that having 2 different budgets doesn't make sense when it comes to government spending, because it's very diverse. And how are you categorizing the 2 things? It's not as easy when you have a single corporation, right, who focuses on a couple industries or maybe one industry, and they know where their capex will directly go into. The government is a massive, massive corporation. It is very difficult to identify those 2 categories, in my opinion. But that's what he's saying, that his capex, capital spending, will be $53 billion in the next year. And then his operating budget on top of that will be $9.1 billion, as you can see right here. In the next years to come, though the capital budget will stay constant in terms of going from 53 billion in the next year down to 48 billion in the 2029 year. Spending as a whole, the deficit as a whole, will continue to stay above this number right here, 48 billion, for the next 4 years at the minimum, in accordance to Mark Carney's plan. And that's worrying, because those projections are worse than what we were projecting under Justin Trudeau. I thought Mark Carney was coming in to bring in fiscal responsibility, to curb government spending, to curb the operating balance, or in his opinion, the operating and capital spending balances, so that we can not put the burden of our debts of today on the next generations that are going to come and who are going to have to deal with the issues and the malpractice that we implement in our government and governance today. And that's worrying, to say the least, because with all this spending, nobody knows if it's actually going to have a benefit. And what we do know is that in the past decade, where we had great spending, where we had massive spending, our and to GDP to wage growth was stagnant. We've been stagnant in this country for the last decade, and it's got increasingly worse under the Justin Trudeau government. And if we look into this proposal by Mark Carney further, his new revenue and savings ideas for the for Canada, well, in the next year, will be heavily based on tariffs, and that's about 20 billion from tariffs. While over here we have an interesting category that says increasing penalties and fines, and that's on the CRA implementing new fines on tax evaders, which sounds good. Of course, it's good. We want to get the tax evaders to pay their fair share. Problem is, how is that quantifiable? How do you quantify who's not paying their taxes properly if you're not investigating it in the first place, or you don't know? If you never caught the people doing it, or the tax system hasn't really identified, hasn't identified who those tax evaders are, how do you know the projected new revenues to come from those penalties and fines if you have no idea what is going on right now in the taxation of these tax evaders? For all you could know, as a government, you and me could be tax evaders. These other major corporations or small businesses or whoever that are evading taxes, who haven't been caught, how do we know? That's the problem. The CRA has done a very bad job at following these cases, and have, more importantly, been increasing their own bureaucracy, having a 65,000 people employment base. And for a country like Canada, that's massive, when the IRS in the United States has like approximately like 85, 90,000. Country 10 times larger than us has nearly the same amount of employees as our tax revenue agency and their tax revenue agency. So it seems very outlandish to me to suggest the projected revenues to come from tax and penalties. How do you identify the source of who those tax evaders are? Where do you get the data, and where do you start in the first place? If you haven't caught them yet, how will you catch them in the future? It seems like a number that just came out of left field, honestly. Then the next number he has in new revenues and savings for the government is increased government productivity, which Carney says he will bring about by increased government productivity, which I can only assume to be new technological innovations being implemented and the gradual um, retirement of federal workers, because Carney has promised not to do a Trump-style layoff of federal workers, nor has Pierre Poilievre. He mentioned it today, actually. So that's the only way I can see increased government productivity coming to fruition. And then in the further down in this plan, you see the full detail of where and how they're going to spend new measures, project measures, and all those sorts of things. And while it seems all great and detailed, it doesn't address the main issue. And that issue will be persistent, is that we're running a deficit in this country. There's a systemic issue with corporations and corporations fleeing this country who don't want to do their business here anymore because they just don't see an economic environment friendly to them. Mark Carney proposes that if we increase government spending, this will somehow quell the uncertainty among corporations. However, it might help to some extent. Will it bring about a systemic change that will make corporations and businesses flood here and come here in droves? I don't think so. I think it's just managing a continuing problem with old solutions, just like how Justin Trudeau did it, just like how Carney's doing it. And that is throwing money at a problem and hoping that somehow it solves itself, but bringing about no changes in actual systems or how the country operates. Throw money, hope the problem goes away. That's what Carney's plan is now. And very disappointing. I hoped, uh, even though I don't support Mark Carney, I hoped for better from him, considering that there is a chance he becomes prime minister. And it's not looking too hopeful in that regard. But thank you again for watching. Give your opinion down below in the comments, and I hope to see what you guys have to say. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.